Alrighty, I've started.
Okay, Linda's muted.
The grant, this sabbatical was done via a grant. And the grant was a product of the Lilly family, who founded the pharmaceutical company. Most of us have heard of the Lilly Foundation, but they also did a separate called the Lilly Endowment. And the Lilly Endowment supports educational and religious organizations and purposes. One program they sponsor is called the Clergy Renewal Program. And that is a competitive program where selected parish applicants are provided with funds for the clergy person to have a sabbatical, which, using Lily's description, will make your heart sing. The grant provides an amount that covers the cost of sabbatical expenses for the priest and also covers the cost of an interim for that sabbatical period. Having the parish apply for the grant for the sabbatical requires that the parish is involved in the planning. The grant funding includes a portion as well for activities within the parish related to sabbatical theme or focus. We were fortunate that the folk at St. Paul's Jeffersonville agreed to work with us to apply for this grant program in early 2016. It was awarded in late 2016, and our sabbatical was May through August of 2017. Our goal was to visit sacred places and people associated with church history and sacred places in creation. It was a pilgrimage, not a vacation. A pilgrimage has a focus, it's more of spiritual practice, and so consequently, we missed an awful lot of things that people on vacation would do. We were in Paris, but we never went up the Eiffel Tower. You know, we saw it as we went by, but it's a different sort of kind of trip. My grandfather, for example, had been a Roman Catholic Dominican brother and then a priest prior to his becoming an Episcopal priest. And while in a priory in the Netherlands somewhere around 1908, had planned a pilgrimage for the brothers to visit a shrine in Germany. And he wrote about it in his autobiography. And we stole a sentence of that to begin our grant proposal. The opening sentence that we quoted was, "The pilgrimage had a unique effect on me. It stirred up deep religious feelings." And it was, he described the pilgrimage made over 100 years before from his Dominican monastery in Holland to the Cavalier Shrine in Germany. Pilgrimages with their eye both on path and place, interaction with fellow pilgrims and introspection yield numerous opportunities for renewal of heart and soul. Because Nancy and I were both brought up in the church and because of the active participation by our families, it was a natural first stop that we were in Buffalo to see our families before beginning 14 weeks of our pilgrimage. The pilgrimage was planned geographically, not chronologically, so things are out of time order, but they make some sense geographically, though when you see the directions that we traveled, it sort of looked like we didn't quite know where we were going to be going, but it worked for us. We began in Philadelphia simply because that's where the Episcopal Church, as we now know it, was born in 1789. We're using pictures we took on our pilgrimage and then adding to that some context and other images and pictures that illustrates the history behind it. So let us begin. It would be helpful if you mute your mic for the presentation, And then at the end of the presentation, we'll stop recording and we'll have time for comments and questions, wonderments at that point. So now I have to remember how to do this. Screen share. Okay. Aha, success. Whoops, wait a minute. That's too far. All righty. The story of the Episcopal Church began with the colonization of the New World by the English. When 104 English men and boys arrived in North America to start the settlement. On May 13th, 1607, they picked Jamestown, Virginia for their settlement, which they named for King James I. And the Jamestown settlement became the first permanent English settlement in North America. One settler was the Reverend Robert Hunt, a clergyman of the Church of England, who was the chaplain of the expedition. He first lifted his voice in public prayer on the new continent on April 29, 1607, when the settlers planted a cross at Cape Henry, which they named after the Prince of Wales. Beginning to build the Jamestown settlement, on June 21st, Hunt celebrated the first known Anglican Eucharist in what the future would be the United States in the newly created settlement. They eventually built a church there. The tower that's seen here is what remains of the church built in the 17th century. It was incorporated into the church portion that was rebuilt in 1907 around the original foundation walls. This church is still in use and is part of an Episcopal parish. As more English colonies were planted, many included clergy from the Church of England, bringing the Anglican tradition with them. The British presence eventually dominated, and the Church of England grew in most of the colonies. The colonial church was under the authority of the Bishop of London. The bishops of London sent a few clergy to the new land. Some were sent as representatives of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in foreign parts, or other missionary societies. There were no bishops in the colonies, so anyone from the colonies wishing to be ordained had to take a long, unpredictable sea voyage to England and back. And a good number either died on the journey or chose not to take the return trip back to the colonies. Ordination under the Act of Conformity in England required everyone being ordained made an oath of allegiance to the Church of England, of which the monarch was the head. The years immediately before and during the Revolutionary War was a great challenge to the Church of England in the colonies. More than any other denomination, the American Revolution divided both clergy and laity of the Episcopal Church, well, what became the Episcopal Church. Like today, the membership covered a wide spectrum of political views and opinions. On the other hand, about 3/4 of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were Anglican laymen, including Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. But many of the clergy were opposed to independence, and a number of loyalist laity also left for Canada or for England. Once the Treaty of Paris was signed in September of 1783, many left the Church of England in America, and about 80,000 loyalists, 15% of what was then the American population, went into exile, 50,000 of them heading for Canada. The church in the newly created nation needed bishops, but the Church of England refused to consecrate any for their former colonies. But in 1784, Samuel Seabury, seen to the left here, was consecrated as the first bishop for the United States by renegade Scottish bishops. Then in 1785, the General Convention of the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America was held. They authorized an American Book of Common Prayer and plans for the consecration of additional bishops. Additional bishops were needed as our tradition requires a minimum of 3 bishops to ordain another bishop. This is symbolic of the fact that a bishop represents and serves the whole church, not just their diocese. One of those chosen to be a bishop was William White, shown here in the center, the rector of Christ Church in Philadelphia, which was then the temporary capital city of the United States. Now, White had already been to England in 1771 to be ordained as a deacon, and then he returned in 1772 to be ordained as a priest. And in 1787, he and Samuel Prevost of New York traveled to England to be consecrated by Church of England bishops to serve as bishops of Pennsylvania and New York. In the summer of 1789, as you recall, representatives met in what is now called Independence Hall in Philadelphia to draft the Constitution of the United States of America. A few weeks later, several of the same men met with other representatives of the 9 original dioceses in the rector's office at Christ Church, Philadelphia, to finalize a draft of the church's initial constitution. At that time, the office was located through the door at the end of the right-hand balcony. With the General Convention's adoption of the Constitution and canons, the Episcopal Church formally separated from the Church of England and had a unique structure that fit with the aspirations of the new church and the new nation. The revised American version of the Book of Common Prayer was produced that same year. And it's interesting to note that the ratification and preface of the 1789 prayer book is still printed in the front of our present prayer book. From that meaning came the structure and representative democracy that epitomizes the Episcopal Church. If we compare the structure of the Episcopal Church, it bears a striking resemblance to that of the United States. Both have an executive branch to help direct the work of the body. Both have 2 legislative houses, with the House of Bishops being like the Senate, and the House of Deputies like the House of Representatives. And members of both houses are elected by the constituents they serve. Both are based on representative and broad participation and the election of officials and representatives. The Episcopal Church is broadly democratic, and the clergy are usually elected by the parish vestry. Bishops are elected by their diocese, and lay persons are encouraged to participate in the work and governance of the church at every level. Just as the Episcopal Church as we know it began its life in Philadelphia, so we began our 2017 pilgrimage there as well. Walking to Christ Church, we passed Independence Hall. Now, Christ Church is still an active Episcopal parish while remaining an important part of the National Historic Park of Philadelphia. And it's open daily for tours led by the Park Service. Christ Church still reflects colonial simplicity. With box pews, which at one time had doors to help them retain the heat during the winter, with clear glass windows and simple lines and furnishings. They still use the original baptismal font in the picture on the left, and like most colonial churches, it features a prominent pulpit in what is called the wine glass style. The altar is a simple, unadorned table. Nearby, in the nave, a plaque lists early rectors and assistants. Note that William White is listed as an assistant in 1772, and in the other column as rector in 1779. Two such assistants, Jackson Kemper and White, became legendary bishops. Another farther down the list, William Muhlenberg, became a noted priest and educator in New York and is credited with the introduction of Sunday school to the United States. All three are commemorated in the lesser feasts and fasts of our church calendar. And finally, the last assistant on the list, William Delancey, became the first bishop of Western New York. Bishop White had been an advocate for the independence of America before and during the Revolutionary War, and he had helped formulate the structure of the Episcopal Church in separating from the Church of England that included the laity as part of the decision-making process. Bishop White later served as the first and fourth presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church. A point of local interest for us in Wheeling is that in 1825, the elderly Bishop White, with the permission of the diocesan bishop of Virginia who was ill, traveled from Philadelphia to Wheeling, both to confirm parishes and to consecrate St. Matthew's first church building in Wheeling. The certificate signed by Bishop White is still proudly hung in their meeting room. Bishop White died in July of 1836 and is buried in the chancel near the altar of Christ Church, where he had served for 65 years. Nearby is the grave of John Penn, a colonial governor of Pennsylvania and the grandson of William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania. Not too far from Christ Church is the Christ Church Burial Ground, founded in 1719. Here we saw a number of historic graves. The most famous and the one visited most often is that of Benjamin Franklin. We also found graves of soldiers from the Revolutionary War, and Dr. Benjamin Rush, who was a physician, a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He served as physician general for the Continental Army, and he was known as a physician at the Pennsylvania Hospital, as well as teacher at the University of Pennsylvania, and a noted humanitarian. Now, for Nancy and I, an important stop anytime we're in Philadelphia is at Macy's, but not for the shopping. The Macy's is the former Wanamaker store, which houses the famous Wanamaker Grand Court organ. And they happen to have a concert daily at noon and at 5 p.m. Originally built for the St. Louis World's Fair, the organ was purchased by the store owner, John Wanamaker, and it took 13 boxcars to bring the parts to Philadelphia and 2 years to install the instrument. And despite its then unprecedented size of more than 10,000 pipes, it was judged inadequate to fill the seven-story Grand Court in which it was located. So, Wanamakers opened a private organ factory in the store attic, which was charged with enlarging the pipe organ. And the organ they've produced is the largest functioning pipe organ in the United States and possibly the world. taking up portions of 5 floors for the functioning pipes, chambers, blowers, electronics, and the workshop. Macy's and the Friends of the Wanamaker organ have spent a great deal of time and money in recent decades to preserve and restore this historic instrument in order to share this monumental resource with the community and the world. And it is in the best condition it has ever been in. In addition, Macy's provides a staff organist and 2 full-time organ curators to tune and repair the instrument. During the concerts, they have video monitors at several locations in the store so people can watch the organist play this magnificent beast.
My Lord, look at that.
The organ has 28,750 pipes divided into 464 ranks. It has 6 ivory keyboards, 729 color-coded stop tablets, 168 piston buttons, those are those little buttons under the keyboards, and 42 controls that are foot controls. It is an orchestral organ, meaning that the vast array of pipes can sound like an orchestra playing. Following the 5 p.m. concert, we were able to see the console up close and to talk with the organist for the evening. And he happened to mention to Nancy that he had forgotten his tablet on which he usually stores the music scores that he plays. So he had to play the music from the screen on his telephone, which he said made his playing a bit slower than normal as he was struggling to read the music from that tiny little screen. And while it was not planned, we ended up finding out that music became an unexpected but delightful and important feature during our pilgrimage. And we'll talk more about that next time and in future programs. As we were leaving, we saw this quote from John Wanamaker that is appropriate for our era as well. Let those who follow me continue to build with the plumb of honor, the level of truth, and the square of integrity, education, courtesy, and mutuality. Our next program, we will be looking at Iceland, Ascension, and the Book of Nature.